Addressing Race and Gender Inequalities in Research, Part 2, Race Inequalities in Research, Higher Education and Citation Practices, particularly focused on the discipline of psychology. Race inequalities in psychological research have long existed. Systematic analyses by Jeffrey Arnett, Henrich and colleagues, and independent replications have found that 93 to 95% of the typical samples in psychological studies that are read, used, and taught are from the global north. This includes North America, Western Europe in particular, and Australasia. When the global south has been engaged with, sometimes it's been argued to be in a colonial and exploitative way. In particular, where global northern concepts, theories, and methods are exported uncritically to the global south, with minimal to no local adaptation, testing, or validation. For example, individualized models of mental distress from the global north have been used unsuccessfully in the global south, with the failure to diagnose, treat, and build cultural resilience to those in the global south. Scientific racism refers to psychology's, in particular, intellectual justification of eugenics. This is the wider movement to particularly elevate and distinguish white people as a separate race that is morally superior to other human races. Eugenics is a flawed movement that has been roundly debunked and rebutted, in particular by noting that race is a social construct, a powerful one that humans are placed into, but has little to no real biological distinction. Psychology supported this through scientific racism, the production of so-called scientific studies or psychological empirical studies suggesting white people were more intellectual, morally superior, and capable, and therefore this could justify the practice of eugenics, colonization, enslavement, etc. Race inequalities also exist in citations and other aspects of academia. Researchers have studied 233 social psychologists on their perceptions of colonial standards of psychological discipline. This includes English language biases, the problem of context, and publishing practices. The researchers found that among the social psychologists, there was a recognition that academia favors English language and disadvantages non-native speakers of English. Furthermore, participants felt that academia biases relating to seniority, connections, institution, nationality, race, and gender converge so that northern-centric theories, methods, and research ultimately is highly privileged above that in the global south. Furthermore, that global northern-southern collaborations can be exploitative, in particular where ideas, methods, data from the global south can be given little to no credit when published in a global northern journal or with global northern collaborators. Global southern researchers face a dilemma then of publishing globally or publishing locally and perishing in their careers. And this is a particular moral dilemma for many researchers who wish to research and benefit their local communities. Beck and colleagues 2023 have found similar in the discipline of archaeology. In very robust experimental work, Kahalon and colleagues in 2021 have found concrete evidence of these perceptions. In pre-registered studies in multiple experiments, they looked at the impact of country title mentions. That is, specifically, research articles that mention the country that the sample has been recruited from in the title of the journal article. In other words, this is acknowledgement of the setting in which a research study takes place. They have two major findings. Research from the global north is less likely to admit or mention the country title that has been researched in the title of the research. In contrast, research in the global south, so South America, Africa, parts of Asia, are more likely to acknowledge the specific setting in which the research has taken place through mentioning the country in the research article title. Unfortunately, when a country has been mentioned in a journal article title, it is less often engaged with and ultimately is less cited. This means that research in the global north faces a double advantage over the global south, in particular in not having to mention the country that they are being sampled, and also through that being more likely to be cited. In a review of all the authors set on a large Bachelor of Science course in UK higher education psychology university, myself and colleagues found that systematically the authors we tended to cite as readings for our students were majority white, in particular white men, fewer white women, and very, very few authors of colour of any gender. In particular, just 4% of any reading authors were likely to be Black, Asian, minoritized ethnic, with the majority of that 4% being men. We particularly found that there were more authors, white male authors named John or Jonathan or a variant of John, than there were of any authors of any ethnicity of any gender. When we did a repeat analysis of this in 2019 versus 2016, we found a similar lack of diversity in our citations and in the readings that we are setting for our students, where 97% were white in the 2019 curriculum. Other research, for example by Kwame Wusabempa and David Howitt, has found racism in the typical psychology textbooks that are taught in psychology curriculums, in particular where Black, Asian, minoritized ethnic people are othered in language, for example placing studies about African people adjacent to studies about chimpanzees or animals, or in general having a large focus on white Western or global northern populations and barely mentioning other populations. So what is the impact of these research inequalities? There is evidence to suggest that inequalities of research can become internalized, where particularly marginalized researchers, including women researchers and racialized researchers, can take on a wider disciplinary or academic idea that their work is less valuable compared to others. In a sense, this is an internalization or similar to the internalization of a male or colonized gaze, where a researcher operating in a discipline or environment that doesn't value her or their research begins to also see their research as less valuable. Another potential internalization or impact of research inequalities refers to reduced advocacy. In experimental studies, Rachel Colagero and colleagues and in independent replications have found that the process of objectification can lead to a state in which women in particular are less likely to take part in collective action. In other words, a woman researcher may not self-cite or speak up in meetings or advocate for her research, not due to a lack of conviction, but a learned response to a system that doesn't seem to value her research or wider contributions. Other potential impacts of research inequalities might be underperformance. Experimental studies by Claude Steele and colleagues have found that enacting a stereotype, such as women are less mathematically skilled than men, can relate in statistical underperformance on maths exams or other tasks, where two groups of people are divided into two conditions, with one condition where a stereotype is enacted, such as tests usually produce a gender difference, and another condition where that test is not enacted. Those who are relating to that stereotype, for example, women and poor maths, are less likely to do well when that stereotype is enacted. This also applies to racist stereotypes. The comic from XKCD also encapsulates this, where a man who underperforms on a maths test will be seen as an individual who isn't good at maths. In contrast, where a woman underperforms at a maths test, this is seen as indicative of women generally. Another potential impact of these research inequalities is underemployment and underpromotion. Earlier, in the first part of this talk, I discussed citation gaps where women are on average 30% less likely to be cited compared to men. We are looking therefore at the citations and who gets cited and who doesn't. But we can also see this as very directly related to employment. Citations are a key metric of promotion and employment in higher education. The name we cite on a CV has also been found to be relating to inequalities. In particular, experimental studies showing identical CVs sent out to the same employer finds that those with white-sounding names are on average 50% more likely to get interview compared to names associated with people of color. This is concrete evidence of wider inequalities that mean whether in academia or other employment sectors, those with particular identities may be privileged above those without. So to summarize and to challenge research inequalities are a well-documented reality in academia, particularly by those facing class, gender, or other race-related inequalities. For example, as mentioned, citation gaps, biased teaching evaluations that are stricter, more objectifying, and typically more negative to marginalized researchers and educators, such as women academics. A wider unequal employment terrain as seen inside academia, but also more broadly in the experimental CV studies. The disproportionate pastoral workloads, particularly put upon marginalized researchers and academics, especially those with lived experience of inequalities. As such, if we think of research inequalities as a documented reality, we see imposter syndrome, the widespread feeling of unbelonging, not as an individual pathology, but as a healthy awareness of this reality, in line with Bridget Rickett and Lucy Thompson's recent Critical Psychology journal article. Therefore, research solutions that challenge this reality, that are systematic, may be more helpful than any individual resources seeking to redress imposter syndrome. Finally, I will give an overview of some of these brief potential resources. Researchers have created citation audit resources that can help, in an imperfect way, identify biases in citation practices. This includes online plugins and analytical code to identify the likely, although not 100% accurately, but the likely gender, race, and sometimes nationality of the authors in a reference list. There is also inclusive citation guidance. Citation and research repositories exist, and one of the key ways that the citation gap has been identified to be able to be closed is through self-citations. Men are typically more likely to self-cite more, women are typically less likely to self-cite and even undercite. There are repositories as well that seek to highlight work by marginalized and undercited researchers in particular disciplines. These ones are particularly related to psychology, including gendered psychologists who face gendered barriers and racialized barriers, but there are also other repositories beyond this, including in economics, methodology, or research methods, and elsewhere. Methods to avoid disproportionate pastoral, equality, diversity, inclusive, and emotional labour for marginalised academics could include random allocation of tasks among group members, particularly avoiding volunteering requests, where this is more likely to be women academics who volunteer for such tasks or face oppression too. Ledgewood and colleagues have also come up with this task force structure, where we can see a central core group of those with lived experience leading in terms of consultation and in the ideas for strategy, and then a wider scaffolding task force chair or implementer team who carry out the actions and strategies that the core group directed. This means that a task force can still be informed by those who are expert or who have lived experience, but that the actual work of implementing those strategies or actions is divided more equally and proportionately. A final potential resource is writing solidarity groups, where people come together with structured writing and in supportive environments to share common barriers and feelings of common barriers, which can help build solidarity to see that these barriers are shared, as well as potential workshops to develop ideas to resist these or to discuss resources to resist these. This includes the writing resource solidarity group at UCD, including our potential workshops coming up. Thank you for listening, and please feel free if you're at UCD to follow more events from us at our website there.